He's on his way.
It's on its way?
That man better show up.
Okay, thank you.
He will be here in 2 minutes.
What?
Sorry about that. I was in a speech in another round. I don't want to get. I was in the city.
Chris. Okay.
I'll text.
I'm gonna head start round.
Alright, I'm good with everyone. What's the breakdown of the floor?
Plano is negating speaking second.
Alright.
Is everybody ready? Yeah, we're good.
Yeah, Justin. I should.
Nathaniel and I were resolved that EU should join the Belt and Road Initiative. Our sole contention is revitalizing infrastructure. After a decade of slow growth, the European economy is stagnating. EU data indicating that 113 million people live at risk of poverty across Europe. The reason comes from Heiko Emmerman of the EIC, who finds in 2015 that most of the drop in growth was due to declining infrastructure spending from public and private players, with renewed investment potentially growing the EU GDP by $2.8 trillion. But given stagnating growth and low revenues, the EU is unable to fund infrastructure itself. And thus, Austin Strange of Harvard University writes in 2017 that under China's Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI, China aims to revitalize infrastructure projects across Europe and Asia through a combination of concessional loans and direct aid. BRI investment would revive the EU economy with high-quality infrastructure. As Ellis of the SRB writes this July, that China has recently improved its practices to comply with EU regulations, ending their use of second-rate contractors and improving efficiency to lower the production costs, addressing the BRI's past shortcomings. Unfortunately, the failure of the EU to join as a whole has held back investment. As Joel Rouet of the Institute of Political Studies finds in 2017, that with much of the EU outside the BRI and little engagement with central institutions, the economic effect of BRI projects in Europe remains limited, concluding that a full endorsement of the initiative by the EU is necessary for the project's success. Thus, affirming would open the floodgates to two crucial forms of investment. First is social infrastructure. China's investment under the BRI would bring inclusive growth to the EU, as Lee Franson of the EU Commission writes a week ago that investment in social infrastructure has reached a 20-year low, leaving Europe's poor in dire straits as education, housing, and health infrastructure are now urgently needed. Franson explains that there's a growing gap of €1 trillion in spite of efforts by the European Investment Bank and local governments, requiring external investment to avoid the prolonged serious impacts. The solution comes from the BRI, as Richard Blum of the Institute of Macroeconomics finds in 2018 that China places special emphasis on making complementary social investments near its transport projects, developing local markets and directly reducing unemployment. As a result, Strange of Harvard quantifies in 2018 that by spreading growth inclusively, every additional Chinese project reduces regional inequality by 4%. Importantly, not only would better social infrastructure directly save lives, but Franson furthers that this investment would enhance productivity and growth, with the countries who invested in social infrastructure faring by far the best during the last recession, as other areas which lacked investment suffered. Thus, Mario Holzner in the Journal of Urban Economics writes in 2018 that investments under a European Belt and Road would increase GDP by 3.5% and create 7 million jobs. Second is transport infrastructure. China's investment under the BRI would increase the EU's trade, as Amagini of the University of Milan writes that trade is heavily reliant on its transport networks, which control travel times and the efficiency of traded goods. Unfortunately, Amagini finds inefficient routes and infrastructure between the EU and China in the status quo make trade costs 20% higher than the average. China's BRI is the solution, as Blum of the Institute of Macroeconomics writes that China's investment focuses on transportation infrastructure projects more quickly and efficiently than their Western counterparts, connecting all areas of the country rather than just the overland routes. As a result, NAC quantifies in 2018 that by lowering trade costs and decreasing travel times, each new BRI connection increases regional trade by up to 13%. Xu of the Institute of World Economics concludes in 2017 that the EU would be by far the biggest winner from the BRI, massively expanding trade with both China and the rest of the world. For these two reasons, Wong of Oregon empirically finds in 2018 that every additional BRI project increases economic growth by 0.7%, and David Lauder of Reuters concluding in 2019 that the BRI would be able to lift 32 million people out of poverty. Thus, we are very proud to affirm.
Can I see the part that China's funding social infrastructure?
Yeah.
And the 7 million jobs.
That's okay.
What's up, listener?
Yeah, it's Holzer.
Yeah. So, Plum and Kirchner. Wait,
Top
what
one
is
is, top one is one, second one is four.
Okay, I think that's Plum is a social infrastructure one, right? Okay.
If you want quantification, we
Can you highlight the parts what parts do you read?
The highlight one.
Only the highlight parts.
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Can you email this part to me?
It's kind of fun.
Just because it's like White House words.
We can point out more specific parts.
If you want to see like a specific, I'll tell you which one.
Can you just email the part to me so we can like put it out? I just send it to
It's on the,
Send
if
it.
you want to check.
Okay. I couldn't access that card on the key.
There's an issue with the URLs. You have to delete the parentheses at the end of the URL. Because like, I just like create a format and then like they include the parentheses.
Okay.
Sorry.
Okay, are you wanna try that? Make sure it works. What? Yeah, I'll just.
Cool. That's fine.
Can we see the second card?
Oh, yeah. Send it to you.
It's at the bottom of this.
Okay. Thanks.
If it doesn't work, we can still like email it to you. Just that might be easier.
Yeah, we got Holzer. Thanks. And yeah, just make sure you're able to go in it also. What was the name of the author?
Holzner.
B-O-B-O.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Can you give me some word to search?
Oh,
Just control F, BLU, yeah.
No, I got that. You did. It's
Oh,
the
okay,
page better.
sure.
the
In
first
the
sentence that we're saying is control F, China might be more effective than traditional financing.
I mean, kind of nice.
In the meantime, are my phones ready? There's ready? Nihar 98 resolved the European Union to join the Belt and Road Initiative, also known as the BRI. Contention 1 is upsetting the US. The Trump administration is opposed to the BRI and its members as Resnick writes for New Republic in 2019. That Trump's policies are aimed at confronting and containing Beijing, by pushing back on the BRI and advocating that countries not participate. However, if the EU joins the BRI, the Trump administration will retaliate. As Subachi of the South China Morning Post in 2019 finds, that the US has a track record of reprimanding allies when it thinks they get too close to China. Europe must choose between China and the US on trade relations. As Team Cow 19 of the South China Morning Post explains, that Trump's decision to ratchet up pressure on Beijing means that countries that seek to coexist with both China and the US are called to prove their allegiance to one over the other. This is why Stevens of 2018 of the NSR explains that Western European countries joining the BRI would signal a decisive shift in strategic direction and historic allegiances. Some EU leaders in recent weeks have further raised tensions by joining China's Belt and Road Initiative, which may be enough to provoke Trump into pulling the trigger on auto tariffs and send the global economy into a tailspin. Problematically, trade gossip in the South China Morning Post warns that if China and the EU reach an accord, it could push trigger-happy Trump to unleash tariffs against European exporters, including that any benefits from an investment treaty with China may be undone by a full-scale transatlantic trade war. A trade war would lead to economic devastation, as Goldstein writes for Market Watch in 2018, that there is a high probability that a major trade war will push the economy towards a full-blown recession. While Bradford of the International Monetary Fund concludes that 900 million people could fall into poverty in the event of a great recession. Contention 2 is by destroying the EU's economy. China has historically participated in unfair trade practices known as dumping. As Christian 2016 of the AALAP explains, that China has demonstrated past willingness to engage in massive dumping at prices below cost, which means to export a product at prices lower than the normal value of a product in order to drive out competition. These prices are so low that European industries cannot compete. However, Europe has taken steps to make sure that dumping doesn't happen right now. As Christian continues, the current anti-dumping measures safeguard tens of thousands of direct and indirect jobs in Europe. But if the EU were to join the BRI, many of these measures would no longer exist. As Elliott for CNBC notes in 2019, that the Memorandum of Understanding signed by China and Italy expands two-way and unimpeded trade and investment. In Africa, the effects have been devastating. After experiencing Chinese dumping, their textile industry has collapsed. As Jolene for Joshua explains, that it is now cheaper to import from China than to buy from a local industry. Finally, the local producers have less than 15% of the market share left, resulting in several business closures and loss of jobs. The impact is an industry collapse. The VOA News finds that the BRI could trigger a significant wave of Chinese imports, which would cause a major jump in unemployment and lower wages for at least a full decade after, devastating the EU's economy. The list of vulnerable industries is substantial. As Christian 2016 explains, ranges from steel and ceramics to bicycles, parts, and solar panels, including that without the anti-dumping instruments currently available, millions of jobs will be at risk from China's unfair trading practices. Negate. Ready when you are.
Would you mind showing me the Zimbabwe evidence for you first?
Yeah, sure. Card, okay? Yeah.
By the way, this is like,
Oh, yeah.
okay, that's 18 seconds of prep time.
Alright, so I'm ready for question whenever you're good.
Could you move it again?
Oh, yeah. This. Cool. Is everybody ready?
Okay. So in your first contention about tariffs, you cite
Yeah.
this Zubachi evidence which says that the United States is going to reprimand its allies.
It says that the United States has a history of reprimanding its allies when they get too close to China.
So, for example, when like South Korea, Philippines, or Japan decided to join the BRI, did the United States do anything?
Well, we'd argue that we're specifically, the evidence that we read specifically is talking about Europe. The reason is because right now the Trump administration thinks that the European Union is allied with the US instead of China. Our evidence is very clear. That the European nations will be forced to choose to either form an alliance with the US or China, or at least that's how Trump sees it.
The way you framed it is that Trump sees his allies, right? And South Korea and Japan are definitely the US's like hard allies. They're like basically puppet states of the United States, right? And then they ended up choosing to go with China. And did nothing happen? Like, did they do nothing? Like, clearly, like, pretty hard allies are shifting to China. And you're telling me the same thing would happen to the EU, but we haven't seen anything happen, right?
Well, we've definitely seen Trump lash out against the many Asian allies as well, right? Trump has come out very vocally against allies, regardless of whether you're in Europe or you're in Asia. Trump clearly does not want them. Can I ask a question?
That's not answering my question again.
I said that Trump has clearly
After-
stated that
after
he is
they chose-
very against it.
After they chose to do the BRI,
Yes.
you say he just
Okay,
asserted
so-
that he's against it. But like, what action was taken?
So Trump has not put tariffs specifically on
So
our
what
Asian
did they do?
allies.
It's great
right?
that he said, "Hey, stop doing that," but they literally just did it. So like, what did they do? What
Well,
did he do?
we
Exactly what did he
We
do?
would argue that that doesn't matter. What matters is how Trump responds to the European nations. We argue the two are
And the
very
best
fundamentally
way
different.
to look at the
Are you've
European
asked a lot of
is to
questions.
look
It's been a
at
minute
its
and a half.
allies as well.
It's been a minute and a half,
Yeah, sure,
right?
go ahead.
So you bring up this idea that China's going to be creating social investment, right?
Yep.
Can you explain what social investment means?
Yeah, so that could be ranging from things like community centers to schools to housing to healthcare.
Okay, so what is China's incentive for building community centers and schools?
Yeah, so for example, we indicate that when you lower inequality, you also increase the economic growth. So obviously, if your trading partner has increased economic growth, the chances are you're going to have increased economic growth as well. So the point of BRI is to increase economic growth, right?
Okay.
So we're saying that obviously, if the EU's economy grows, then China's economy grows as well.
Cool. So how many of these has China built so far? Can you give me a nation as an example?
Yeah, for example, we indicate that, for example, from the Rueda, once the EU joins as a whole, the initiative becomes much more widespread, and the only thing that is lacking right now is the legitimacy of the entire EU.
Okay, so two things. First of all, can you give me an example of a country where China is heavily invested in this social infrastructure you talk about? Like, how much has China invested?
Yeah, sure. So we indicate literally across all of Chinese investments.
That's not a country.
Look, Chinese investment is Chinese investment in other countries. If you want me to pull up a card that gives you an exact country, we can handily do that. But I'm going to tell you right now that Chinese investment happens in social infrastructure along the BRI transport projects. For
Sure.
example, I would say probably in Kazakhstan or Laos, where they also build transport projects where they also need social spending.
Great. So
Very simple.
yeah, if you could give
But
me
can I
like a
ask you a
piece of evidence from like Kazakhstan or Laos.
Right. Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Yeah, so in your second contention about dumping,
Actually, that's about time.
okay.
Alright. Is everyone here? Okay. Time starts now. In this round, for our arguments about the EU's economic growth over theirs of recession. They've argued that recession would happen if the EU joined the BRI. And you might believe all of this is entirely true, but recession is still part of a long-term boom and bust cycle. In general, economic crashes will happen every several decades, as we've seen like with the 2001 crash, 2007 crash, and we'll soon see another one. The issue with my opponent's entire case is that they're simply kicking the can down the road. Maybe they stop one recession from happening, they won't stop the next 10 from happening, and they're choosing to do that at the expense of measures which would make the recessions much, much better. The first measure that we talk about comes from our first argument about social infrastructure. As the Washington Post finds, investment in social spending actually acts as automatic stabilizers during recessions. When people fall into poverty as a result of recessions, they then qualify for these programs, giving them more money to put back into the economy, increasing demand, and boosting us out of the recession. That's why Francis Evans from the Journal or European Commerce finds that during the last recession, the countries that did invest in social infrastructure saw no economic downturns as a result. The second one comes from our trade argument. Because as the economist finds, Europe's main threat to their economy today is their lack of exports and the status quo, because exports fell heavily, and that's what, as a result, the Great Recession hit Europe very hard. But given Europe's reliance on exports for their economy, they got out of the Great Recession by increasing their exports. Over the long term, increasing trade is the best way to create resiliency to recessions, because you interconnect economies and ensure no one country is going to bring down the entire system. With that, you can't vote on either of their contentions, because they're only delaying the inevitable, whereas we're the ones who are changing the current status quo of vulnerability to a massive economic downturn. Their first contention says the US will get mad if the EU joins, but they've given no real indication as to why tariffs specifically would be the measure that the US takes against its allies. As my partner points out in Crossfire, countries have joined the BRI, and we see no requisite tariffs from happening as a result. And specifically, they mentioned Italy joining the BRI. Yet Jones of the World Times finds in 2018 that after Italy joined, the US will increase investment to win Italy back. The reason why tariffs wouldn't happen is that they just push the EU farther away from the US when the US's objective is to get its allies back. We would see tariffs happen, we'd see more investment. The second issue comes from their own evidence. They cited Dustenberg and Tritcast, both of which are not talking about the BRI alone, but are talking about greater processes happening in the status quo. They're talking about disagreements between US-EU economic policy, issues with subsidization, disagreements on WTO reform, which is why Conspirator of the Atlantic Council finds in 2019, the very tariffs their evidence is talking about will be imposed in the status quo. Voting for them only guarantees that their impact will happen. So again, you should be voting for the affirmative to decrease the reliance of the EU on the US as spreads to the EU economic policy finds. When the EU and China can increase their trade reliance, you decrease the negative effects of tariffs because now the EU is no longer relying on the US. Look, the US is probably going to impose tariffs in the status quo regardless. There's many other reasons for Trump to do so, such as decreasing the trade deficit or protecting domestic industry. The best thing that the EU can do is not wring their hands and say, I guess we shouldn't join the VRI and make Trump even madder. We should take action to avoid the harms of those tariffs. Their second contention argues dumping would happen because we'd get rid of the regulations. But on face, this argument pretty much makes no sense. If the EU knows that it's going to crush their economy if they get rid of regulations, they have no reason to destroy their own economy, which is why two of the CEPS finds in 2016 that specifically these anti-dumping regulations are so integral to the EU's relationship with China that they would never be taken away during trade negotiations. Their arguments may have happened in places like Africa with weak trade governance and insufficient governing, but the EU is a strong country which has sufficient trade infrastructure, which has been in place since 2007. We have no reason why all these initiatives would go away just because they signed a piece of paper. The second issue is that they talk about how an MOU happened and that increased free and open trade. This is the vaguest language they could possibly have used, as they have no reason why they would get rid of these trade regulations that prevent China from dumping, which is why Russell 19 of Reuters finds that BRI countries still impose tariffs on Chinese exports. They have no reason to force them to get rid of them. This is why they do say they increase trade under that MOU, but they never say they increase dumping. As a result, they give you no empirics for whether this has happened in specifically EU nations. As Small of Oxford finds in 2018 that the EU has strict single market regulations that prevent many of the issues from happening in other places of the BRI from happening in the EU. Overall, voting for them only guarantees that the next recession will hit even harder in the next 10 after that. You might buy their entire case that we stopped one recession. They're guaranteeing the next one will crush the EU economy and the world's economy. Voting for us is the best way to avert those harms and thus to affirm.
Can I see just any card that like social infrastructure be developed in a specific country? I don't care what country.
That's the card that I sent you. It's talking about a data set of all of Chinese.
I mean, it doesn't name it.
It's just like a general broad thing of like this is what they do.
Yeah, but
I just
there's
want
no
specific
specific
words that say social.
Would you like me to open the data set that they use?
Either that, like if you can find a specific country, maybe I do that.
Yeah, give me one second.
Cool. And then you have just highlight the part where it's upset.
I mean, it's a data set.
We're gonna run a couple seconds of press while we don't work for it.
Look, this is like a really, really good paper. So I've got the data set that they use.
Or can you, just highlight the part that says like social infrastructure, like anywhere in the states.
Yeah, we just want to see it.
Yeah, we just want a country where China's been doing social infrastructure.
That's it.
That is all it is, yeah. We'll to speed things up, we'll just like run our.
Here's like the first example.
Okay, cool. Hang on. Social infrastructure. Okay.
That's just one example.
Yeah, okay.
That's gonna be like a single example.
That's fine.
We'll continue prep. That was 25 views.
Also, can we see who as well? That says that EU dumping policies won't be removed. Yeah. Thanks.
8 responses are all just weighing on their own case. I'll address that when I get there. Then they try to tell you that there's no tariffs right now, and instead you see investment actually go up. However, we'd argue the reason for that right now is because Trump is pursuing like a nice guy situation. You see, trying to bribe European countries to not join the Belt and Road Initiative. However, once they join, it's seen as like a betrayal to him, and therefore then he starts like the tariffs. That's why right now they're seeing investment, but if the EU were to join, like the entirety of the EU, you'd see tariffs happening at that point. But then they try to tell you that like there's no tariffs in this quo and that kind of thing. But there's tariffs in this quo, and therefore impacts have already triggered. But what Reuters explains on October 17th, we're literally quoting the Secretary of the Treasury of the United States, which said the current tariffs placed on the European Union, the Airbus tariffs, are actually very limited in scope, not very large, and not planning to expand a lot. That's why it's dramatically different from what they're talking about. That's why it's dramatically different from the tariffs the US is going to place on the EU for for the BRI and that kind of thing, because these tariffs aren't going to have like a significant impact, but the Trump tariffs for the BRI are likely to result in recession. But then honest second attention, try to tell you that like anti-dumping policies are being taken away. However, Holland specifically tells you that because like the EU is a bunch of small different countries, they don't collectively have like the leverage, they're too fragmented to actually stand up against China, which is really important because it means they're not able to fight the free trade agreements like my opponent suggests. But then they try to tell you like that they just keep the anti-dumping policies and they still be trade. We realize the link into my opponent's contention too is literally the idea that you're going to make like transportation costs cheaper, and the only way you can increase trade by making transportation costs cheaper is if you sell goods for a cheaper price. So, like people are more incentivized to buy it. Because of that, any linkage to like increased trade is inherently reliant on dumping. But on my opponent's case, first to start off talking about how through like the Ellis analysis that China's complying with EU regulations. However, their own Ellis analysis concludes that China's actually doubling down on lobbying efforts, which is really important because what these lobbying efforts do is they make sure that China's always going to get the bid to every single infrastructure contract because China has like connections to the people who are running these contracts. What that means is we're never actually sure if there's a better alternative to China for investing because China always uses lobbying efforts to get rid of it. To make sure they always get the bid. And second, CGDF explains in 2018 that like the anti-corruption policies my opponents are talking about aren't actually successful. The reason for that is because China implements top-down corruption policies where they try to like get the officials to help solve back for the problems. However, in order to actually solve back for corruption, it needs to be a bottom-up approach because it's the local level, like the people who are like supervising the project, the local level workers, it's where the investment in the projects fail. But then on my opponent's first one about social infrastructure. First of all, we looked at the data set, it's just like a bunch of loans and stuff. It's never actually specific like the hospitals that they talk about. It's really like, I think it's pretty misconstrued. But even regardless, we realize that infrastructure fails for a couple of reasons. The first explained from Hillman in the Washington Post in May, who explains that officials just embezzle money away so nothing actually gets built because there's like a lack of regulations right now. The second explained from Chun Zhang from the CNBC, who explains the vast majority of workers used to build these projects are Chinese workers, not domestic ones. That's really important because Gaston explains that because it's not domestic workers like actually doing it, no one's actually trained to maintain and repair these kind of infrastructure projects, so over the long term they fail. That means two things. First, their weighing is entirely short term because like the infrastructure projects fail in the long term, and second, it means that we could be funding like better infrastructure projects, but we're not. And then finally, that's why Atifa and Saar from the Center, or from the CSIS in 2016 concludes that like 55% of these infrastructure projects are unprofitable because they literally just don't work well as my opponent suggests. But then on the second warrant about like transport infrastructure, look to Brisner from June of 2019 who explains that the vast majority of these trade routes my opponents talk about are pointless and are actually economically unprofitable. The reason for this is because these trade routes are actually built to just like improve China's image, not actually like encourage any trade. The reasoning for this is actually pretty clear because they explain that the EU has very little that China actually wants. China produces everything the EU produces plus a bit more. So there's no reason for like the EU to be exporting a large amount of goods. Because of that, trade is like a one-way street and you don't see trade routes actually being successful. And then furthermore, they're trying to talk to you about like this, realize this, all the responses made before about how like this infrastructure fails because of the lack of regulation, because of the lack of workers, because of the investment, all apply to this warrant as well. Because transport infrastructure is just another form of infrastructure. And finally, on the impact level, realize we talk about 32 million jobs. That's in the status quo. That's not talking about whether the EU joins or not.
We'll run for time.
18 seconds, take it from zoom out. Could we see the evidence that says 55% are unprofitable?
Yeah.
Oh, we'll run a little.
social infrastructure argument says China's going to use Chinese workers.
Yes.
So like, let's just like walk through what this really means.
For sure.
Are you saying that China, when they're gonna try to like build maybe a hospital in Europe, they're gonna take like 20 Chinese guys, get them on a plane, like get 20 hotel rooms, and then have them work on the project for a month or two,
You can
and
call the
ship them
argument
back?
stupid, but the data disproves what you're saying. I
Wait,
mean,
wait,
like
hold on.
90%
Where's the
of
data?
workers for Chinese
Whoa.
projects are
Chinese projects, but like as thus far, the BRI has been mainly in countries that are in Chinese
Yeah,
periphery, countries
so
like
for
Kazakhstan,
Chinese,
that are around China.
infrastructure projects funded by China, run by China. I think the number is 90% of
Okay.
them are
So-
Chinese domestic
then
workers
my-
who work
My
on them.
follow-up question is,
For sure.
we've seen the BRI expand to some EU nations, like Slovakia, like Hungary.
Yeah.
Have we seen them use Chinese workers in those projects?
I assume so. I can't
Do you have
guarantee
any
it.
evidence? Because if we give
Well,
countervailing
so-
evidence saying, for example, in Slovakia, China primarily uses local workers because, again, it's much cheaper to hire somebody who's in the area than
but
ship a bunch of Chinese people
Insofar as
on a
I can
plane.
give you general evidence talking about like all their infrastructure projects, one specific country does not disprove the norm.
The
Right? Like an outlier never
point,
disproves the norm.
no, the point is that specific country is within the EU, and as the small evidence that we read
Can
in
you tell me
law
that?
says,
Can you tell me that every EU country is going to do what Slovakia did?
no, but we can tell you that because they're in the EU, they're subject to the EU regulations.
Why do the
small
EU
evidence points
regulations
out,
mean this?
our small evidence points out
Yeah.
that China may have invested in its own companies in other projects.
Sure.
But within the EU, they have strict rules concerning the tendering of different projects. That means China cannot tie the financing of BRI projects to its own companies, which means that overall we're going to see only benefits.
So,
like, wait,
no,
hold on.
if
I'd
they
like to ask
can't
you a
tie to
quick
other
question.
countries, then who's investing?
The EU, no, like China may finance the projects, but the EU companies are building them. And you argue that they're not trained to maintain these projects.
Yeah.
Like, what do you have to learn? Like, why can't they just maintain the projects like they maintain any other projects? Are BRI projects
I mean,
special?
typically it's like a specialization of construction, right?
What
Like,
is special? What does that mean? That's like pretty vague.
I can't be more specific than the card is, but the card basically explains that it's like, I assume,
Like-
the way traditionally the like infrastructure works is people who like build a project are probably more ready to like repair it.
Why?
But like,
What do you have to know to repair?
we spent 2
It's
minutes
like-
on this, can we move on?
Okay.
Okay, cool. So let's talk about like the tariffs that you're talking about, right? So the current tariffs that have been status quo that Trump put on a couple days ago, like how substantial were they?
About $7.5 billion.
Right, and like how substantial are, $7.5 billion, and are those like likely to expand?
Yeah.
Okay, but like,
So like you said that the tariffs that you're talking about would cause recession. Like what tariffs are you talking about?
I mean, the card's pretty general in saying it's probably going to place like a 25% tariff on EU
And
imports.
that's what's necessary to cause recession.
At least, yeah. And also,
Okay, so
wait,
as
the
per
secondary
so
part,
like,
wait, the
so
secondary
look,
part of
I
this,
read your,
what's
so look, I read your evidence, and
For
I
sure.
noticed that it was talking about a 25% auto tariff. Which is why I said my conspiracy evidence, which is also talking about a 25% auto tariff, says that's going to be imposed in the status quo, which is what I
Wait,
said in rebuttal.
where do you say the 25? Like,
No, I said
What's that?
no, I said
Like-
the evidence that the tariffs that your evidence talks about are being imposed in the status quo.
No,
That's what the conspiracy evidence says.
tariffs that are being imposed in the status quo are 7.5 billion on things like
Will,
specific food
no, the
items.
point is,
What's
they may not have been
more
imposed
important?
yet, but our conspiracy evidence says the significant incentives Trump has to impose them regardless will cause them to be
Wait,
imposed,
but
which
I'm
you never
telling
frontline in rebuttal.
I do frontline rebuttal. I cited the Secretary of the Treasury. I think he's more reprehensible than anybody yours.
You've taken 53 seconds of prep time. Do you mind showing us the part of our LS evidence that says like China's double lobbying efforts and is getting all the big things?
Yeah, make sure this is your house.
I-
Not over here.
Actually, you
Taking 1.5 that way. Before.
This is all. This is below our. I think it's there.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah,
cool.
cool.
Fine, sure.
Oh, so that's 2 minutes and 54 taking overall leading up to 6.
Alright. It's going to be starting on our case, then weighing, then going to their case. Is everybody ready?
Wait, can you say that again? I'm not catching that.
Okay, never mind. We're starting with weighing, and then we're doing offense. Then we're doing our case, then we're doing their case.
One more time?
So weighing, our case, their case.
So the stuff that I started with the fine.
Is the wing the same wing that we're talking about earlier? Is the new wing?
It's the new rebuttal.
Bottom line.
Okay.
So
Same
everybody-
wing.
Sorry. Recessions come and go, but voting affirmative is the best way to limit both future recessions and the incoming one. We indicate that recessions are inherently a boom and bust cycle. They come and go very quickly. However, we also indicate that they're just kicking the can down the road. However, the best way to solve both this recession and reduce the impacts of any future recessions 10 down the line comes from our Washington Post evidence, which indicates when you increase the amount of social infrastructure and social programs, it acts as an automatic stabilizer, which increases the economy, allowing more spending and decreasing the effects of a recession both here and down the line. But here's how we win into our social infrastructure argument. We vote on our first contention about infrastructure, specifically social infrastructure. We indicate from the Franzen evidence that right now social infrastructure is at a 20-year low, and Blum indicates that the best way to solve this is to have the EU, have China's BRI invest, and Strange says each project decreases inequality by 4%, and Holzer concludes that this would increase GDP by 3.5% and create 7 million jobs. Their first response is about lobbying. However, it doesn't really matter as long as they're increasing the social infrastructure. But second, this card also concedes that the only reason why they're doing the lobbying is so they can get a view of the area so they know what they're investing in. This is literally like counterintuitive. But the second response is they talk about corruption. You can group this with their next corruption response from Hillman and also their Chinese worker response from Chandran. As we indicate from Small of Oxford 19, that was read in rebuttal and not addressed in their rebuttal. As we indicate, the EU has very strict regulations, which A, prevent Chinese companies from coming in and only allow EU companies to do the projects, but B, only allow EU workers to be doing it because the EU companies are doing it, but C, having EU officials running the projects. That's why Small concludes all of these negative benefits that they talk about in their rebuttal have never happened in any of the EU countries that have already joined the BRI. Right there, you're building social infrastructure, and that's why you're increasing productivity and lowering reducing the effects of a recession. They also say that our card about social infrastructure is not specific. A, I highly encourage you to call the card, but B, we say that the Blum evidence is a holistic analysis of all Chinese investment. That's why we say it's much more, although they can bring up like 1 or 2 examples, we can bring up the entire Chinese investment history, and Blum concludes that they're always investing in social infrastructure. The last response I give you is from the CSIS saying that 55% are unprofitable. But the card that this card is also citing is talking about domestic Chinese infrastructure production, not external BRI production. That's why we say already that the internal Chinese construction is already good. That's why they're not really having much benefits. But on their first contention about tariffs, they don't respond at all to the Kasperic evidence, which specifically says that the auto tariffs that they're talking about in the status quo are happening. And they don't respond to the Frederickson evidence, which says the best way to limit the effects of future tariffs and the current auto tariffs and the incoming auto tariffs is to link it with China more so you reduce the reliance on the United States. That's why we gain offense on their first contention. But on their second contention, they also drop the Small evidence, which indicates that A, dumping has never happened in the EU states that have joined, but B, the best way, also their Holland evidence, which says that there's no collective response, is talking about the status quo. We say the best way to have a collective response against dumping is to have the entire EU join as one collective, united front. That's where we're very proud of.
We'll take some prep time.
Before we do that, the front line you read that says that EU regulations means that all the bad things will never happen. I'm running 5 seconds of prep. Which card is this? Is this a new card?
No, it's the same one that was right at the bottom.
Okay. Alright, the order is going to be the half, the neg, and then weighing at the bottom. So starting with the all space. Okay. Is anyone not ready? Okay. Let's start on my opponent's first contention about infrastructure, where there's a couple of really key mishandled arguments. The first is the Alice analysis says that China is doubling down on lobbying right now, where they're spending a lot of money to lobby EU lawmakers to let them do whatever they want. Their frontline A does not actually respond to this argument, but B ignores the nuance and the implication, which means that so much lobbying is going on, there's going to be no checkbacks into making sure China doesn't deploy bad projects. The other frontline they read comes from Small, that says that EU regulations will make sure that none of this ever happens. Realize that when we call for this evidence, it's super vague. Don't let them use it as a catch-all that says, oh, there won't be any problematic projects in China that China makes. Instead, look to past evidence, all of our evidence from the CG Dev, from Wilman, that says that Chinese corruption policies are failing right now because it's from the top down and not bottom up, which means the Chinese officials are going to embezzle money, causing these projects to fail. But then, go on to the second war about their second impact, where they talk about trade routes. They dropped this, but it's still going to be really important. I'm going to tell you why in a second. Let's go on to the first contention we read, which is about tariffs. They try to extend a couple of responses here through Inc. that says that Trump's imposing tariffs now, and so the EU needs to join the BRI anyways. The problem is, first, they don't respond to when Nihar says in rebuttal that says that Trump isn't imposing tariffs on countries like Italy now because they're trying to bribe Europe into not joining the BRI, which means that once they join, then Trump's going to be like, sure, we're going to impose tariffs. But second, even more importantly, Reuters explains that the tariffs now are not automobile tariffs, they're very limited, but the BRI tariffs will be much larger and much more devastating. We're not really going for this argument though. The real place we're going to vote for is on dumping. Because if the EU joins, China will use dumping to cripple dairy economy. Because our Christian and Elliott evidence explains that regulations protect the EU from dumping right now, but when they join, these protections go away. And China floods the EU with cheap goods, so domestic businesses cannot compete, and it goes for all kinds of sectors like steel, aluminum, and solar panels. Then, all of their responses. The BRI is different, and regulations won't stop China from 5 reasons. First is that Jacobin 2017 explains that the BRI will encourage internal competition for Chinese cash, which will result in political support for these projects. Second is the Holland Evans Red rebuttal that says that these EU nations are too reliant on China already, and the EU is fragmented, so they can't stand up to China on any economic affairs. His summary response says when we're talking about the scope, not about the scope. Even if they joined as a bloc, they're still going to be very fragmented. But the third, look to past history. Because when Africa joined the Belt and Road Initiative, Jalot explains that domestic textile manufacturers now control less than 15% of the market, since China undercut them so much with cheap exports, driving African companies out of business. But fourth, look to the EU in the early 2000s, when they didn't have these regulations implemented, we saw massive Chinese dumping that crippled their economy. But fifth, realize that the affirmative trade argument, the second impact I told you to think about, concedes a second link into dumping, because when it becomes cheaper for China to export goods into Europe, when infrastructure decreases trade costs. Our impact is that EU companies will go bankrupt, which means that millions of people will lose their job. Here's how we outweigh their arguments. The first that argument, we outweigh in the long term, because our impact is not talking about recessions. The VOA evidence says that an economic collapse and business failure will last for decades. This takes a long time for businesses to recover if they do at all. This takes out their weight, since social spending will never be able to fill the gap if the economy collapses. But second, our argument is a prerequisite to theirs, because it short circuits all their analysis. First, because a Chinese company takeover means that China is the only country that benefits from trade. But second, and more importantly, is that when EU industries collapse, their economy goes down, which means there's no demand or profitability or any money to pay for the trade infrastructure in the first place. And these are the reasons why you must negate.
Alright, ready for that?
Yeah.
Yeah, we're good.
Okay. I think that's, yeah. You read the VOA evidence saying that, like, an economic collapse would not be a recession?
No, that's not what the VOA evidence says at all. The VOA evidence says that Chinese, do you want to explain?
Yeah, so the vote evidence just basically says that like a Chinese import shock in the European Union would cause unemployment that would recover for at least a decade.
So
That's
yeah,
all.
That's like a recession.
what's the difference?
Except that it's lasting for a decade, and it's like
Wait,
entirely.
that just sounds like a long
That just sounds like a long recession.
Yeah.
Point out with the
Yeah.
EU evidence that
There's
as we
like
pointed out,
fundamental differences between like a
as
drop in
Bronx
unemployment
finished.
and a recession.
and we point out with the EU evidence at the very top, the EU has had a decade of stagnant growth from the last recession. I see no severe difference between the recession argument that we're making and the argument that you're making. That sounds like
there's
two
huge-
things with two
there's a
different
huge
names.
difference. Because we actually, first of all, like actually gain impacts off of this of the loss in jobs. Like, you can't just tell me that's not important. And second, your whole analysis about how like there's a cycle of it. There is not like a cycle of people losing their jobs for 10
Well,
years.
in fact,
that's not what a recession is.
No,
The
like
Great
the
Recession
definition-
massively
That's
increased
not what a
exactly
recession
what I'm
is.
saying.
Wait, a recession a recession is like the whole like business cycle idea.
And
I'm not
then
that
the
great at
result-
econ,
wait,
but I
the
can tell you
result-
the difference is it's not going to recover from this. The idea behind the dumping
Yes,
argument
they
is
didn't
China is
recover.
always going to be able to undermine local industries,
They didn't.
which is dramatically different because there's no solution to this problem like there was with the recession.
Like,
you
They
can
did.
just
There
add
was
stimulus.
There is no
right?
solution. There was no solution to the Great Recession within
wait,
Europe.
here,
The
let
point
me
is
explain.
Europe still has not recovered.
Wait, let me explain this, right?
significantly from
For
the Great
example,
Recession.
if recession tends to just go away after a while as the economy slowly goes back, right? The
No,
problem is,
no,
isn't
strongly
when China is
literally
always
indicated
dumping
at
goods,
the top of
continuously
our
dumping
page.
goods in Europe, Europe won't be able to recover. We'll see industries continue to go out of business for decades.
Like, just like you've asserted that recessions can be recovered from, but the only way that happens is when you have
That's a
sufficient
fundamental
investment in
principle
social
of economics.
infrastructure.
Like,
It's
I
not-
want you to
The
Our
words
impact
fundamental
has never
principle are
been
not
about
a word or
recession.
evidence supporting your argument.
I can
You
pull
can't
up
just-
like a Krugman textbook if you want. Like,
Well,
I don't know what to tell you.
Like our
Like,
argument is
you
not
can't just
talking
say-
about recession. It's clearly very different, right? Look to
I mean,
Wall Street
if
in
it-
2008,
I
right?
mean, like, if it looks like a recession, it has the same effects as a recession.
It does
It's
not
probably
have the
good.
same effects as a
What,
recession.
people go out of business and people
And
lose their
you
jobs.
can't-
That's like
just
exactly what a
Wait,
recession.
the underlying reason behind why a difference between a recession and the dumping argument are like fundamentally different. You can't just look at
What-
the impacts and
what's
assume the
different?
journey there is the same.
What difference? People lose their jobs? Like, do people not lose their jobs in a
Yes,
recession?
because the reason why people lose their jobs in a recession is an entire global economic decline. The reason why people lose their jobs in dumping is because they're being undermined by Chinese
No,
importers because they
dumping
can produce with a
causes-
lower cost, which is really important because the ability to undermine will last for however long China's able to
Y'all want to
produce
move
with
on
a
a
cheap
different
price.
topic?
No.
Well,
Alright,
I mean,
keep
like,
going.
Wait, I'm down for this. Like,
Alright, you know what?
I mean, like, you still haven't answered the fundamental question. Like,
yeah,
if the
so
difference
the
is like,
basis behind a recession is not the basis behind the dumping argument, right? Like, even though they both might result in unemployment, one lasts longer and one has like a much more substantial warrant.
no, you just said that the dumping would have an effect
Oh,
that
also,
lasts
wait,
up to a
your
decade,
point-
which
no.
hasn't, which has an exact effect of the
At
recession.
minimum
Are
of a
you-
decade. Hey,
are
it's,
you-
it's, it's the opposite. It's at minimum of a decade.
At minimum of a decade, so like,
Yeah, which is the opposite of that.
and as we point out from the recession impact, we still haven't seen the EU recover from the last one. We obviously did.
Wait, we haven't
okay,
seen the EU recover from the, what, 2008?
Yes, that's why
we read that.
113 million people still live at risk of poverty.
113 million people still at risk of poverty because like, the EU doesn't have finances for others.
Alright, like,
Yeah, for social
how much time do y'all have?
8
8 seconds.
6 seconds.
Alright, go for it.
It's going to be the same this summer, starting on the weighing, then on our case and on physics. Time starts now. The massive economic downturns we're both talking about happen in either world. We pointed out that recessions are part of a boom and bust cycle, with people still losing their jobs, business still going out of employment, and on net, massive economic damage happening once every couple of 10 years. We've given you the way that we address this with our Washington Post evidence saying that the social infrastructure and investment serves as automatic stabilizers, giving us an ability to recover out of recessions. When people fall below the poverty line, they then qualify for these programs, get benefits, put money back into the economy, and recover from the recession. Let's be very clear. The responses to the swing are brand new in their second summary. Far too late for them to respond to the crucial issue that divides us around whether or not the EU is going to see this happen in the future. Because they've just said we see economic damage that lasts in the long term. Because we're going to see cyclical recessions happen in the long term, the only way you address that is by reversing the current downturn in social spending. We've given you the Francis evidence saying that in status quo, social investment is at a 20-year low. They've asserted that China would lobby this to have Chinese corruption. In general, this is not applicable to the EU, as the issue is not with local contractors, as their evidence is talking about, but with the EU's regulations as a whole. We point out from our small evidence, the EU has strict regulations preventing China from using the same issues as in other BRI areas, such as tying their financing to Chinese companies alone, which is why small can lose. The main issues we see with the BRI in other areas are not seen in a single EU member country, which is why they can't give you any examples of this happening in the EU. They've asserted there would be investment, same response. We gained access to our Blum evidence saying the BRI would invest in social infrastructure, massively expanding that, as our wholesale evidence concludes, we increase GDP by 3.5% and create 7 million jobs. They have no quantification on their side, they're preferring our clearer impact. Let's go into why you can't go into their dumping argument. Because we'll click quickly on tariffs. Again, they dropped the Kasperic evidence saying the exact 25% auto tariffs they're talking about will be imposed in status quo. You then go to their dumping argument because they've really not responded sufficiently to our WHO evidence. Because overall, because these anti-dumping regulations are at the heart of EU economic policy concerning China, they have no reason why China can just bully the EU into getting rid of them. They give all these reasons that are brand new in second summary again, but you can group pretty much all of them that are happening in the status quo. The Jackanow, Holland evidence, and Africa evidence are all happening in the status quo, but they don't apply to the EU's actual regulation. We haven't seen any of these go away. This is why you can vote for us. It would prevent dumping from happening, and we have no way to get rid of those. The EU's got to crush their own economy. Thus, to improve the economy in the long term, we're proud of it.
20 seconds. It's going to be pretty quickly on tariffs, and then on infrastructure, and then on dumping. Cool. Okay. Starting off on tariffs, remember the response they made that auto checks are going to happen anyways, that not unique to their impact. On infrastructure, realize they try to use the small analysis as a catch-all. You can read it if you want. All it tells you is that they follow regulations regarding the use of Chinese companies. It has nothing to do with the other part of things, the corruption that we're talking about. Because of that, you can extend two responses, CGED and Hillman, both of which tell you that first, that the anti-corruption policies that China is implementing are not actually successful because they're top-down rather than bottom-up, and the corruption happens at the bottom. And then Hillman contextualizes this from the Washington Post by explaining the reason it happens at the bottom is because officials are able to embezzle tons of money away from projects and nothing actually gets built. That's terminal defense on their case, because insofar as nothing is built because the money is embezzled away, they have no actual offense in today's round. But the place you vote on is dumping. The place you vote on is the dumping argument. Right now, if the EU joins the Belt and Road Initiative, China will use dumping to cripple their economy because they can always produce goods at a lower cost than what the EU can. That's really important because Christian and Elliott explained that so far when countries have joined the Belt and Road Initiative, they've gotten rid of these trade policies and it's resulted in this kind of dumping. On the impact level, Christian tells you that if you don't have these anti-dumping policies, you lose a ton of jobs. And the VOA contextualizes this, telling you that if you see these Chinese import shocks, you would see unemployment for at least, or massive amounts of unemployment for at least a decade. That's really important because my opponent's only response to this is like they don't want to remove these anti-dumping policies. But we responded to this as soon as we literally could because it was a front line to a front line, which was second summary. It's the Jackanow and Holland evidence that basically would drop in the last speech. Jackanow tells you that because there's so many countries in the European Union competing for funding, they all struggle and they don't actually work together, meaning they don't implement these policies because they're all bending to China's will. The second is from Holland to explain that the EU is really fragmented because China's leverage over all of them individually through economic reasons. Both of these combined means that the EU is going to get rid of its trade policies or its anti-dumping policies and it actually be dumped on. That's really important because that outweighs on a couple of fronts. First, because it offers on time frame. Because realize insofar as you see massive amount of unemployment for at least a decade, that means that is a long-term collapse. The second is because we short-circuit their impact because social security spending can't account for social security spending can never fill the gap if you see continuously increasing unemployment. And finally, realize, and for those reasons, alright, good job.
Can I see this infrastructure data set?
The what?
The infrastructure data set.
Or